I loved your book about video games. Game life is amazing.
Thank you.
I confess that this is where I could tell a slight, not like generational divide, like I'm an older millennial, but some of the games that you were playing were like ones that I was playing at like my dad's office on the weekends when he'd take me in order to relieve my mother for a little bit. And I'd just be there like playing on all like, the blazing fast 286s. Right. So I did get a bit of like, there's some Might and Magic in there. There was like Commander Keen and stuff. But I think that the two things that I found very powerful and resonant in that work of yours were, one, how my memory of like my narrative biographical like life is really, as is the book, structured around like memories that I have. They're very vivid of playing video games and of like being in virtual places, more so even necessarily than like physical places I've been or journeys I've taken. Like I remember like F-19 stealth fighter, which would run on DOS and had the like, you'd hit control something. So you get like boss mode. It would be a spreadsheet if someone looked over your shoulder. I remember figuring out you could land this stealth fighter and then just drive it around like a tank. And I just remember that being, I'm sure other things were happening in my life. Schools were changing, events were, relatives coming and going, all the sorts of things that kids only dimly understand. But I do remember like, I'm driving through downtown Benghazi or like through a big polygon labeled Benghazi, just like blowing up oil derricks. And like, okay, that happened. And that has an intensity more than anything else. Maybe it's a screen memory. I don't know. But then the second thing that leapt out at me and which I found incredibly powerful about that book, but also this Bears on Pan, where you can, on the one hand, conjure narrative voice, this like imminent, precocious, authoritative and deeply insightful, like childlike voice. Where it's like, this is the world as it's first unfolding to me. This is the fun of playing like Call of Duty or Wolfenstein, right? These kind of experiences, but then also imbue that retrospectively in a way that freights and quickens those experiences with adult meaning. And the bit that I was specifically drawn to, and I know that there's some audience members who have actually asked us questions about this and been like, well, you like Wolfenstein. What about the 2001 Return to Castle Wolfenstein, like the slept on entry in the series?
Yeah.
And I've played that forward and backwards, wonderful multiplayer and all that shit. But the bit where you describe the nature of like fun or the way in which this playable world is created as both so captivating for the child, but also capturing these kind of adult fantasies. And the line that just, or the two or three lines that really leapt out at me were, but to shoot at people who are shooting at you as part of a titanic struggle where every bullet you fire simultaneously lifts you up, gathers you into grateful millions, all facing the same way against the Nazi wind. That's totally fun. And then later is reflection on how, and I think this is part of that astute adult analysis, the way in which all these games, which are about like the Great War, the Good War, this war that we can all jack into that frictionless movement together with BJ Blazkowicz, is very much a type of adult nostalgia for something that you cannot mine elsewhere. And this was the bit then where you bring in how history doesn't make sense. The objective necessity for history is over in this end of history capitalist moment. And we can find out exactly when it stopped. Because when the fun experts want to make a game that is totally fun, they discover that the closest time period they can set it in is World War II.
Yeah.
Brilliant.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, there's a lot I could say about that. Thanks a lot for getting into that book, which of all my books is the one that I feel like I think I hear about the least.
Mm-hmm.
But the people who have like reached out about it and the readers I have for it are like, super into it, which I'm really, really grateful for. Yeah, for games, I mean, first of all, the thing about World War II, I mean, like, part of the conceit of the book is like, I learned things through games, and they were real. You know what I mean? And it was sort of about trying to learn, like to really sort of suspend what I know about things like history as an adult and so forth, and try to ask the question, let me just suspend my disbelief and really take seriously what I learned when I was like 8 playing Castle Wolfenstein. You know what I mean? And then it kind of made sense to me. It's like, Hitler gets bigger every year. You know what I'm saying? I mean, it's crazy. It's like that shit hasn't gone anywhere. You know what I'm saying? And it's yeah, there's a sense of a kind of collective, like we're all in it for good, we're all fighting. And also the experience of being in an army, you know what I mean? Which has, for like millennia was this like major thing, an evolutionary thing, arguably, something that I never experienced, something, and of course, with the all volunteer army and the ways that it's basically preys on lower income folks and so forth. That doesn't really, and now we've got drones and shit like that. But that's fun, you know what I mean? That was something I learned that was when I was 8 playing those games. In general, and what you said about being a kid and thinking about your memories and having them intertwined with these games. I thought a lot about that because I wanted to write a book about like what it was like between I was like 7 and 12, those years, which I think are really important and also really, really hard to write about. And when I was writing about it, I sort of realized, the games provide a framework for me to recapture in memory what and access what that was like. And yeah, I think I'm the first generation to grow up playing computer games. You know what I'm saying? Or sort of so somewhere in that zone. And so it was interesting for me that way. And what was curious was computer games, at least back then, and I think to some extent now, but we can talk about that. Back then, it was this new sensorium,
Yeah.
but a super reduced, abstract, and simplified sensorium, like because the games had really, really primitive graphics. But there was something about the very primitiveness of those graphics that just was so fascinating in enabling me to look at the world through unexpected angles. And then the book is sort of about the interaction between those game worlds and the things I discovered or learned when immersed in those games, and then like the regular world of like popularity in fourth grade. You know what I'm saying? Like stuff like that. So yeah.
I'm so struck by how that period of time, that 8 to 12 year sort of gap, which I kind of blessedly don't remember a lot of sometimes. Like it goes back and forth. Like, is it good that we forget this? Is it bad that we forget this? Which feels like a very psychoanalytically informed question in some ways, right? But it is this period, and this is, I think, a through line in several of your books for this story of like worlds unfolding or like encountering the world for the first time. And if anything, a phrase that kept on coming into my mind that's used in Pan is this line about like the physics of consciousness, right? The way thoughts sort of happen and they knock into one another. And between that and this downright lyrical, but still constrained in the vocabulary of the narrating subject, I found myself thinking of your books as like this kind of, or part of what's going on in these amazing books is this like phenomenological description of experience in these periods when we're kind of laid bare to it, or it's happening in kind of the first time. And whether it's, you're a parent, I'm thinking about people who have kids where like a kid is telling you about their life and they're just going on about it. And everyone is such an important character. And so is always doing this. And this person loves this. And if you listen to this song and it means so much, this is literally about me. And you're like, my God, this kid who knows so little also knows so much. Or going back as an adult now and trying to play some of these games. I've played some games on Twitch, right? And at one point, actually, a designer for, I think, the first Call of Duty, the one that's, I mean, it's the second one. It's where you're in Stalingrad and they give you the rifles like as you're.
It's great. Yeah.
It's sick. Yeah. And he dived in and we was talking in the chat and I'm like, this is amazing. And yet also I couldn't help but be like, yeah, this is really simplistic graphics, right? Or like the characters are like sprites, right? I remember this is the case in Wolfenstein too. Like they have a front image and a back image. You can't really see them from the side, right? They
yeah.
And yet somehow, even as an adult, I'm like, oh, this is so flat. Like it's one JPEG repeated over and over again. It's all the same things. When I was feeling it as a child, I'm like, this is an entire little world, right? Or someone like, there's a secret level. You got to go to this wall. And I'm like, oh my God, I'm going to go there and find it. And so everything becomes saturated with like this intenseness and this portentousness. And it all seems to be there for you. And perhaps there's a through line between that and other types of imaginative play. But what thinking about your work, whether it's on drugs or video games or this novel or elsewhere, kind of suggested to me was that kind of like fecundity can also be like among adults, like there's some overlap with madness there, or there's some possibility of like, yeah,
Oversaturation doesn't always feel good. Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. I think that's super insightful. One thing, and I noticed because I have a daughter who is a young daughter now, and I'm really interested, and something that I think is easy to forget is the extent to which children understand the world through imagination. You know what I mean? Like what'll happen? She just started kindergarten, and she'll come home and she'll create little like games with her dolls and create sort of exercises for them to do. You know what I'm talking about? And it's like so she creates a world, but this is the thing about the primitive graphics. There has to be a distance from reality to unlock that kind of imaginative richness. You know what I'm saying? And so it's that I think is what's really important. That's why I think so many of like really successful games now, Minecraft, Slay the Spire, and so forth, are like totally very, very simple flat graphics, right? Because it's a difference from reality. And reality, and I'll get to the madness piece, which I think is fascinating too. Sometimes reality, and I think especially when you're a child, can feel like charged, mysterious, inaccessible. And so creating little worlds or models in which the imagination has room and has access and is not constrained by all these mysterious rules in reality. I think that's one thing. But I think as we get older, and I also suspect even as a child, reality is actually less rich. It becomes dull. We become habituated to it. You know what I'm saying? We no longer see or really feel or recognize things simply because our response has been so automated to it. And so having something with some distance from reality can sort of function to unlock that kind of richness and that intensity of experience. The fascinating thing, Hannah Arendt talks a lot about this idea of the common world, right?
Mm-hmm.
A public world,
yeah.
A world that's between us, as a foundation for society, for history, for communal action, you know what I mean? And even for individuality, in that, she uses the metaphor of a table. The table's between us, but it establishes you're over there, I'm here. It establishes our position, and the table, but it's like really crucial. If the table's gone, then it actually becomes a question where you are, who you are, and so forth. One of the dangers and the sort of excitements of this fascination with worlds and with imaginary worlds, different worlds, other worlds, is it's a dissolution of that common world. You know what I'm saying? And when those common markers like disappear, it's a big threat. And in a way, I think this is like a reason why there are so many platforms now, like Twitch and so forth, YouTube, dedicated to sharing or making public video game experiences, because they can feel so private. You know what I'm saying? And I feel this personally as a writer and as just as a person, very, very drawn to different worlds, outside worlds, new modes of experiencing reality, but simultaneously, because of the anxiety that triggers of like, maybe I'm fucking crazy. You know what I mean? Like maybe I've really lost touch, or I could lose touch. I'm also really, really drawn to the objective, to sort of like ways of bringing personal experience into relation with something public, which is why I'm like in that Game Life book, I'm like super interested in numbers. Like numbers, I've never been good at math. You know what I mean? Like I always had a sense of numbers as being this ultimately alien thing, but I was always fascinated by them because they have this kind of objective, imagination resistant kind of quality. And to me, the great moment in gaming, in the history of gaming, is the moment when Gary Gygax decided to combine, sword and sorcery imaginative settings with dice, you know what I mean? With random number generation, with numbers. And so that gives it, just the fact that there are numbers, it means it's not that anything can happen, whatever you want in your imagination. It's actually, it's got like, I use the metaphor of it's like, the imagined world is like the flesh, but the numbers are like the bone. You know what I mean? And like the musculature that enables you to actually walk and move in this world as if it's a real world.
listening to Ordinary Unhappiness, a podcast about psychoanalysis, politics, pop culture, and the ways we suffer now. I'm Abby Clune.
I'm Patrick Blanchfield.
And today I am so pleased to welcome Michael Clune to the show. Michael is the critically acclaimed author of the memoirs Game Life and Whiteout, The Secret Life of Heroin. His academic books include A Defense of Judgment, Writing Against Time, and American Literature and the Free Market. Clune's work has appeared in venues ranging from Harper's Magazine, Salon, and Granta to Behavioral and Brain Sciences, PMLA, and the Chronicle of Higher Education. His work has been recognized by fellowships and awards from the John Simon Guggenheim Memorial Foundation, the Mellon Foundation, the Baker Nord Center for the Humanities, and others. He is currently a professor at the Chase Center at the Ohio State University and lives in Chagrin Falls, Ohio. Thank you so much for being here. We're really excited to talk with you about Pan.
Thank you so much for having me.
Michael, you're a prolific writer, both in the academic world and in terms of non-academic writing. I will say that I first encountered your work in your memoir, Whiteout, but Pan is your first novel. Can you tell us a little bit about the origin story of this book, about your move into fiction, and how you came to write a novel about, among many other things, panic and anxiety?
Yeah, thank you. So this is, of all the books I've worked on, this has the sort of the longest kind of genesis in that I started working on it way back in 2014. And it took it took many forms. And so originally the first kind of inkling of what became this book was a novel, and it was going to be a novel about consciousness and about someone being possessed by some kind of otherworldly entity. And you know what I was trying to do was just sort of find a literary, in a narrative form, to capture just the weirdness and strangeness of consciousness, which is something that's its strangeness is so hard to bring out, not because it isn't genuinely strange, which neuroscience and philosophy will tell you that it's maybe an insoluble problem, but that it's so familiar to us that it can be hard to awaken the strangeness of it. So I started with this novel about this guy being possessed by an entity that was somehow identified with consciousness, but really brought out the weirdness of it. But that it didn't really it sort of went off the rails. It didn't really work. It was too science fictional or something. And then I started writing it as a memoir because I thought, well, what are the kinds of experiences that I've had where consciousness, just the feeling of thoughts, the feeling of consciousness becomes salient, becomes strange, becomes emerges from the background into the foreground in this kind of terrifying way. And for me, that was the experience of panic. I suffered from panic attacks when I was from about the age of 15 to around the age of 18, 19. And so then I said, yeah, I'm gonna write a memoir about panic attacks and try to get at these issues, these questions about consciousness and stuff like that, to that. And then my agent Denise Shannon was like, you should try writing this as a novel. You know what I mean? And I was like, and it was because my actual experiences at that age, they were fairly quotidian. It didn't really have not that super interesting stuff happened that was legible on the outside as interesting. So I started messing around and being like, whoa, I can make stuff up. And that ended up working a kind of at first I kind of called it an enhanced memoir, like a memoir enhanced with fictional elements. And then I just went off. I really sort of developed it in directions that were very fictional. So that's kind of how it happened. And then Helen Runer, my wonderful editor at Penguin, was super helpful. She basically saw that there was one thing that was missing. There was this thing that should happen in the middle that was not there. And at any rate, her and Denise really helped me doing something which I'd never done before, which is write a novel.
Yeah. Shout out to Helen.
Yeah, we love
Helen.
Yeah, she's great. Totally great.
She's totally brilliant. Yeah.
So part of what we loved about Pan is how richly layered and textured the narrative is. The book invites all these different interpretive frames, and it raises so many fascinating questions about genre, about time, about experience. But before we like really get into it, and before we like get into like what is time? What does time feel like? In as much as like I might
Being in the world.
being in the
Solved.
world
There
go.
we
Yeah. Before we go in that direction, because the book has only recently come out, so especially for the sake of listeners who have not read it, can we just flesh out the setting and set up the narrative in bare terms, however reductively? This will also mean sketching out the background and character of the narrator, Nicholas or Nick. What kind of a person is he? What's going on in his life?
Yeah. So Nick is 15. He's from a lower middle class immigrant family. His mom came from Russia, and he is living in this lower middle class, sort of like an anxious place economically, a kind of lower middle class, like sort of little community of townhouses in a real suburb in Illinois called Libertyville. And his mom kicks him out of the house because we never really know exactly why, but he's just becoming difficult, or she's having problems with him or something like that. And he goes to live with his dad, who works long hours and is not home very often, and he starts to experience these panic attacks. So then what happens is he tries to understand these panic attacks using the kinds of tools that he has in the 90s, which don't really include the internet, and is like reading books at his local library. He's also like really crucially got this friend group. He becomes friends around that time with these really sort of exciting and edgy, like slightly older teenagers who have this barn on the property of one of them, that they've converted into this like psychedelic trip kind of palace. You know what I mean? Teenage palace. And so he's sort of like simultaneously trying to understand what's happening to him with these panic attacks, and trying to make friends with these like interesting people who are like open-minded and are listening to music and talking about things and reading books that no one in his life does. And then gradually they sort of become convinced that he's actually possessed, that his panic attacks, instead of being a symptom of a psychological problem, is actually some kind of religious or quasi-religious or cultic kind of phenomenon where he's possessed. And he sort of resists this interpretation even as he's intrigued by it. And his girlfriend Sarah is super into this idea, and he never knows if they're like the kids in the barn are fucking with him, they're just like taking tripping and shit like this, or whether there's something like some real kind of pagan energy in what they're in the strange rituals they begin to sort of adopt. So that's the basic framework of what the novel's doing.
Without spoiling anything, one thing that struck me about the narrative is that it's narrated retrospectively from a sort of indefinite future. And in fact, you thematize this question of like looking back from the future, and the future is sort of this place, and futurity kind of suffuses things. So we know this is a period in Nick's life that he's, I don't want to say like gotten through, but is like working through from the vantage of somewhere it goes without necessarily knowing where it's going to go.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's this kind of propulsive, almost fateful or fatal character to it that serves it just in the diachronic and I guess like the meta diachronic framing of the text that really works, I found, to dramatize this experience of growing up simultaneously in a place where like there's sort of nothing happening, or like people are boring. And I think that's a general feature about wherever you grew up in some ways. Like people are sort of boring, but also people are fascinating, and somehow everything seems like it's pregnant with meaning, or like something is going to happen and it's going to be huge. And did you hear about this thing that happened over the weekend? Or check out this new kid. He's crazy, but no, he's really crazy, right? And you're like, well, what does that actually mean? And you work through the tools you have, and within the frame of the text, the fact that this young man is both like overstimulated yet understimulated, and also experiencing things for the first time, meeting new people for the first time, reflecting on both like problems of like how do I stay cool or what is coolness, and the descriptions of what coolness means are
Yeah.
amazing in this. I loved it so much. Cool is minimal consciousness, approximation of the smooth, unblinking surface of polished stone or metal. Cool is alliance with endless strength of the inorganic. Panic, on the other hand, is the excess of consciousness. And it's so amazing because on the one hand, I'm like, oh, this is reminding me about like the self-consciousness that's ubiquitous and so excruciatingly cringe about growing up. But it also,
You're like made up of nerve endings.
oh my God, constantly. And
I mean,
yeah.
we are, but you know what I
Yeah,
mean?
like,
It feels
like
like
frayed,
it feels like they're all on, you know,
and yet it's also
all on fire. Yeah.
a kind of like, I don't want to describe like nostalgia for, I don't know, like the first time like I ever like smoked weed and had a panic attack with some kids. I'm like, oh, I don't want to go back there. But also that was a thing that like happened, and it happened in a way that is, even with the lacunae and the things that I've deliberately forgotten or don't want to remember or just can't recall because, you know, we were smoking weed. It had a kind of like evental character. It was something other than everything else. And that sort of sense of this is happening right now in a way that nothing else has, combined with, I know I will look back on this later in some sort of way, just saturates everything with possibility, but also kind of like danger and meaning all at the same time. And the book just delivers this.
Yeah, it's so interesting reading reading Pan next to Whiteout, which has a really different relationship to time, in that it's always circling around the first fix and I don't even want to say nostalgia. It's not really the right word, but the sort of attempt to return to that origin point. But, you know, from the perspective of somebody who is an adult, right? You know, there's an adult consciousness there, but there did seem to me a way to kind of lay these books together in terms of their almost frantic approach to deal with the problem of time, which presents itself so differently as an adolescent and as an adult. But
yeah,
thank
you. I mean, those are super interesting questions. And yeah, one thing I wanted to do with this book, with Pan, and we can talk about Whiteout for sure, which I do think is different in some ways. But what we're going to do with Pan, which I think you described really beautifully, Patrick, is I wanted to tell the story from a perspective which wouldn't foreclose or minimize the sort of like really intense and fabulous and terrifying energies of those years of like you're like 15, 16, age 17. In other words, I didn't want to be from a perspective in which the narrator had gotten through it to a place where he now sees that what he was going through wasn't that big of a deal. You know what I mean? Like was minimized, or he was in possession of a kind of recognizable medical or public framework for understanding and putting what happened in a box. You know what I'm saying? Like I wanted it to be, this was a perspective that had fully realized the implications, the strange and bizarre implications of what Nick was going through when he was 15 and 16 with these panic attacks and these strange rituals in this barn with all these weird kids, and was preserving that. And as opposed to with Whiteout, which is a memoir, and it's told from the perspective of recovery, right? It's looking back on addiction from the perspective of recovery, which is definitely, you know, for me, one that has passed through and gotten to a better place. You know what I'm saying? Like gotten to a place, and also a place in which a lot of the things that I was going through as an addict, which I was not clear about, I now have a lucidity about and an insight about, right? But with Pan, I think the danger would be, and I think it's very difficult to avoid when you look back on your teenage years, is you have a perspective in which, well, I'll give you an example. So there's a character named Todd in the book who's based on a real person I knew, and his later life didn't turn out great. You know what I'm saying? It just didn't in kind of really tragic and depressing kinds of ways. But I didn't want to at all adopt the perspective which I think is so unavoidable when we look back on high school years, which is like, where was it leading to in terms of adult success?
Yeah.
Or where was it leading to in terms of adult like happiness or whatever? You know what I mean? Instead, I wanted to be like, this dude was at that age, he was like amazing. He was like super amazing and strange, and like even at that time had this kind of sinister, tragic power. And it doesn't matter what happened later. You know what I'm saying? Like that, what he was and what he represented at that time, to me and to other people, was something beautiful and powerful. And it was almost like, and this gets back to like, Achilles, you know what I'm saying? Like the idea of the point at which the person becomes fully themselves and becomes transformed and transfigured. That can happen very early, much earlier than like our adult frameworks make allowances for. So yeah, and so the perspective that the novel is written from conserves, and we don't know a lot about this person. Originally, I had a longer coda, and Helen, I think, brilliantly was like, just cut this thing down, like, you know what I mean, like just make it a little bit more like gnomic. And I thought that really worked well. So you don't really know a lot about the perspective from which this is written, but it's one that is like everything weird and strange in that Pan experience. It's one that knows more about the weirdness and believes more in the extremely weird interpretations of what had happened, as opposed to someone, and this would be myself in my own life, this is why it's not a memoir, who would look back on my panic attacks at age 15 and 16 as a phase that I went through, you know what I mean? And the weird self-conscious, but I was, ended up becoming someone else. There's that famous maxim, Solon's maxim, call no man happy until he's dead, right? Which with the idea there is just, things seem to me, I'm 50 years old now. Things seem to be going pretty well in my life. All the things are going great. Wouldn't you call me happy? And then, Aristotle's like, yeah, but tomorrow, the feds break in, you know what I'm talking about? They find the corpses buried in the yard. You know what I'm talking about? Like it's not until it's over that the meaning, just look at the sentence, the meaning of the sentence I'm speaking won't be, you won't know what it means until it comes to an end. It's the same way with a life. And so having that end, but having it like end, but also preserve what force was giving it closure, remain somewhat mysterious, was sort of the trick I was going for. And I don't know. And I think for some readers it works, and for some readers it doesn't. You know what I mean?
I think, Pan is it's in some ways a Bildungsroman, like really, to use that category very broadly, let's say. But I think in addition to that, part of what our listeners are going to be especially attuned to is that it is also the story of Nick developing symptoms of psychic distress and even pathology. And so, the book depicts the subjective experience of experimentation with drugs, of panic attacks, obsessional thinking, dissociation, and more. And as the book proceeds, I think many of our listeners are going to find these symptoms successively more legible diagnostically, and ominous prognostically. But of course, this, unlike a lot of what we talk about on this show, it's not an actual case study, right? This is not the story of Anna O. And Nick's encounters, which I think are both tragic and also hilarious, his encounters with a psychiatrist and a therapist that does CBT, they suggest the insufficiencies of medical diagnostic schemes of interpretation. So I'm hoping we can talk a little bit about Nick's distress, about his friend's distress, and about how Pan explores adolescence as a time of this emotional intensity, change, social experimentation, and these feelings of experiential profundity. And how, as we kind of hinted at before, but didn't quite get to flesh out, how they can bleed into madness, and what that suggests about adult experience by contrast.
Yeah, that's great. Now, and I'll say, absolutely, it's not a case study, but it is. A lot of the book is really based on my own experience of panic and of generalized anxiety disorder at that age. part of what I wanted to do was go back and sort of excavate what the experience was like of having panic erupt into one's life and having no frameworks to make sense of it. You know what I'm saying? Like, and this is where it's really different from today, where you can Google on the internet, and there can be a whole pathology of me trying to diagnose myself on the internet, but I can certainly learn a lot at a really basic level about what symptoms mean or how they're often interpreted. That really wasn't available in the 90s at that time for me. And furthermore, there wasn't anything like the kind of ambient pop cultural understanding or vocabulary of mental illness that there is today. You know what I'm saying? So it was this situation where, I mean, panic is kind of indescribable if you haven't experienced it before. And if you don't know it's a panic attack, which is very often the case when people first have panic attacks.
Yeah, they land in ERs thinking they're going to have a heart attack. Yeah, it's
very often. Yeah, very often it's. And I read this really interesting study. I read this was a while ago. This was back, I think, in the early 2000s. And I no longer remember the source, but someone had sort of interviewed people who had panic attacks and heart attacks. And they asked just sort of experientially, which one was worse. And like by a large margin, people said the panic attack is worse.
Oh
you know
God.
what I mean? Because it's just this, like, it's this feeling all of a sudden everything in the world gets super intense and charged with a doom-laden meaning. You know what I mean? And it's just like nothing else. And so I wanted to go back, and this is the other piece of that of this, which is, and I want to be careful when I talk about this because I'm by no means someone who's like an anti-psychiatry movement person or anything like that. I've benefited greatly from psychiatry and therapy in my life, in all kinds of ways, and tools that I've been given to manage my anxiety symptoms and so forth. But just as there was a terrible cost to being undiagnosed or misdiagnosed or underdiagnosed at that time, there was also a kind of benefit, which is, and this is something, Heidegger talks about, and Emerson and a lot of writers and philosophers, which is the idea that, we have this sense that there's this kind of baseline normality, and that our moods, or mood disorders especially, are like clouds or distortions that come across the clear lens of ordinary cognition, ordinary perception. But in fact, some of these moods sometimes disclose things that are real and that are not quite visible from the perspective of other moods. So in other words, our moods sometimes know things. You know what I'm saying? And like for me, the things that appeared in panic as strange and as terrifying, like being in a body, the weirdness of the difference between one's mind and one's body, the fact of death, all of these kinds of things. It's not like they're not real. You know what I mean? Those are really weird and strange things. And they became salient, and I got a perspective on those questions and those issues that gave me what I felt like was real knowledge. And so I wanted to sort of be true to that and sort of like listen to that. You know what I'm saying? When I was writing that, even though, and I write about this in the book, this is Nick's own experience, when you're in the grip of panic, what you want is the comfort of a perspective that will diminish the intensity of the symptoms. And I was denied that perspective. I really wanted that perspective, but writing it, what I wanted was something different as a writer, which is, what did the world look like for panic and from panic's perspective, if that makes sense?
Yeah, no, I mean, I felt over and over, and I mean, I do know what panic attacks feel like. Would not recommend.
Totally.
But it reminded me when you were talking of, first of all, about Heidegger saying being held out into the nothing, which discloses certain things. Like, you don't want to feel that. Like, the nothing feels terrible.
Yeah.
Right. But it also, I had this, as you were talking, this memory of, this must have been like 10 years ago, of having an encounter with a student who was really in the throes of philosophy. Right. I would never talk about my students' personal experience on the show, but they came up to me after class and said something like, "How do you do with this as your job? Like, why are you not just having an existential crisis all the time?" And I said something like, "Well, I'm 30." That was my answer. And I was just like, there's not a better. And that was the end. There's this moment also just that I want to make sure that I won't read this whole section, but this is the part that will live rent free in my head for the rest of my life, is the two subsequent meetings that Nick has. First with the psychiatrist, who seems like he's going to give this relief from the perspective of he's gonna be able to take it away, right? He's like, he gets it. You're not psychotic. You're not crazy. Starts talking about these wonderful things called benzodiazepines, and Nick starts to be like, oh shit, like maybe there's gonna be a pill that's gonna take it away. And then the doctor is basically like, oh no. That's panic disorder. We can treat that. You've got this other thing. And here I'm going to quote from you. This is the doctor. When Nick's like, what can we do for you? And he says, nothing. And Nick goes, nothing? Nothing, he repeated. Benzodiazepines are very effective over the short term. They're ideal for the intense bursts of fight or flight response triggered by panic attacks. But generalized anxiety disorder, as its name implies, is located not in 3 to 5 minute blocks of time, but spread out over the entire length of a patient's existence. The entire length of existence? Yes, he said. The panic is slightly diluted, as it were, and poured into thoughts, which efficiently transmit the panic across the entire 24-hour spectrum. At which point I was just dying, because that's true. I mean, like it's such a phenomenologically accurate description, and yet it's the way that it's medicalized is hilarious. It's sort of like, well, we're just going to give you a little panic drip and that will be anxiety, which is so, I mean, because there's this philosophical difference, right, between fear and anxiety, right? Fear has an object, anxiety has no object, right? And this is part of what makes anxiety so terrifying, right? Is it's not that you're like, oh, there's a lion and it's chasing me, and then, you get away and no more lion. It's, there's the signal happens, but there's no object to it. And the notion of just that kind of drip, drip, drip titration being spread out over the course of 24 hours a day, 7 days a week for an entire lifetime. I mean, it's just, I don't have anything more profound to say other than like, that feels like a very good description of anxiety, because it also, I'm getting into this drip because it's like, it's the water that you swim in. It's the air that you breathe.
Yeah. It's interesting. The fear-anxiety distinction is fascinating, because that's absolutely right. Anxiety is objectless, but it's always looking for an object.
Yes.
You know what I'm saying? Like it's hyper alert, hyper vigilant for objects, because, and it's fascinating how that works, because when you have an like having an object is better than not having an object. Right?
Yeah.
But so there's something weirdly kind of soothing if you have an object. But of course, the kinds of objects anxiety is likely to settle on are exactly those objects that the fear of which cannot be allayed. You know what I'm saying? Like it has this kind of, in other words, the object comes to kind of conserve the endlessness and focuslessness of the anxiety. So worrying, like I had this that I talk about in the book, I had this very strong symptom when I was having a panic attack or in an extremely anxious kind of situation. It would feel like my thinking and looking, like my consciousness was like, could like come out of me. You know what I mean? And it was a feeling of the imminence of that about to happen. But what the object of that kind of weird unsettlingness created this other anxiety that then settled on, well, what is consciousness? Where do thoughts come from? You know what I mean? Those are, having that as an object of like, not necessarily fear, but kind of like, and this is another weird thing about anxiety and panic. its objects can often be indistinguishable from objects of awe or wonder, like religious objects. Like, what is this weird, strange thing that I'm doing right now? Where do these thoughts come from? And it's like a holy terror in a weird way, because this is a real weird, mysterious thing that happens to us all the time. But now I'm just having this certain perspective on it, which brings it into focus and makes it strange. And then, and this is getting back to the question about madness. The ancient primordial question about whether what madness reveals is something like prophecy or something like delusion. You know what I'm talking about? And that ambiguity runs all the way through the Western tradition, right? Plato, right? Like famously, when to kick the poets out, they're crazy. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
But of course, there's
they're going to bring disorder to
right. They're crazy. They're going to disorder. They're going to destroy the common world. But on the other hand, the idea that what you're seeing is real, or is like powerful, or is something that potentially everyone could experience and see. And this is another thing about setting this book in a high school context, because the only social setting where you can sit around and like ask people like, dude, what do your thoughts feel like? You know what I mean? Like that's with a bunch of stoners in high school. Like if I ask you that now, you're going to be like, what is this? What kind of game is this guy playing? You know what I mean? Like it'll come off as affected or whatever. But then it's like, that's what you talk about when you're stoned and you're 15. And like, but what if one of you is really, you know what I mean? Like that, for that question is like super salient. And another thing, the kind of things that people get anxious about, they always walk this line between, you can listen to the kinds of things that an anxious person is anxious about, and it's hilarious. It's totally dismissible. It's like, what are you talking about? You're anxious about that? That's totally crazy. But on the other hand, it's like, well, wait a second. You know what I mean? Like we all are going to die, you know, like, or whatever, you know what I'm saying? Maybe I should be thinking about this more too. So anyway, yeah.
Or I'm thinking about like the kid who's, is she going to call me back after I invited her? I left a message about going to prom. Is this person's friend going to hear what I said to this other friend about what I think about a fourth party? And
totally.
And like, I don't want to trivialize it. Like kids do horrible things to themselves or make rash decisions because of those stakes.
Yep.
And as an adult, part of you wants to be like, don't worry, you will meet other human beings apart from like the 30 in your homeroom, or like the experience of first love is overwhelming, but don't worry, maybe you'll fall in love again. Or like people won't remember what you wore in that time, right? But on another level, like that properly existential level, like the search for love is enough to, that's one of those life things, right?
Yeah,
or like
yeah, for sure.
Anxiety about how you appear to the world is one of those like life things. And even as we kind of want to poo-poo or trivialize or like look back on in a kind of quaint mode, the things that become the vessels or the first expressions of that for us as kids, or for the kids we want to console, those still remain urgent, properly like existentially laden things.
Yeah, they're tuned into it in a way that might be more sort of correct. Right.
This gets on this, I think, and there's something so profound in the book and in what you're saying about this, both, and maybe just to put it in more meta terms before getting granular, like, as we talk about the experience, like the first experience of panic, right? Or the first experience again of like feelings that are feelings that you have not had before, right? And puberty is like paradigmatic in this way, right? You are not just like inhabiting a world of objects or having this kind of like object seeking impulse, of which panic I think is quintessential, right, putting into play. You're also, and I think this is very much at play in these ideas of like, it's in the surround, it's the air I'm in, right? As you write, when you're in a state of panic, you feel completely alienated from the object world. Panic shakes the thing that you are in horror. Panic belongs to the air. What all these kind of suggest, and again, I'm framing it in sort of theoretical terms, is these processes of being overwhelmed by objects, or like looking for an object and not knowing where it is, or just, again, being kind of mediated and losing yourself in that mediation. These are experiences of becoming a subject, right? and integrating experiences into subjectivity, and they're intense. And a thing that I was really struck by this book in doing in a way that I couldn't think of other texts that have done, right? Part of me was thinking a little bit like Dostoevsky's Underground Man, or like K. Redfield Jameson, or Styron's autobiographical work, but it does present in a way that I think many of our listeners, particularly clinicians, will be like, oh, this is just on point, independent of their personal experiences, like the etiology of symptoms and the way they kind of build, and the specific, the obsessions with, like, I don't know, on the one hand, the very humorous fixation on like the word diarrhea, or like you can invoke diarrhea as a reason why you didn't have to be somewhere as a kid, right? I had diarrhea. I had to go. But then also the horror over this kind of phobic object that is the word diabetes. And then maybe possibly lurking and connecting between both these is like divorce, another sort of DI word. I think clinicians who read this are like, oh, this is both accurate, but then we'll also be like, oh, what happens later? Where is this kid going? Or what was the event in this kid's childhood that we don't know about, that he refuses to think about or refuses to disclose? And is that refusal to disclose itself dispositive of something? It's a playground for that in a way that I think people, clinicians could be up late debating at the next conference that they go to. But it's also, and I think this is properly existentially profound, this kind of exploration of like causality and narrative, and how we retroactively narrate ourselves into being in terms of, well, here, the logic of the symptom, right? Like these, and the kid himself Nick himself seems like, well, I kind of have the sense that maybe the panic is related to what happened with my parents in the divorce, maybe, and what happened in the household earlier, maybe, but also maybe it's, certain things trigger him, sexuality, other stuff, but he never really resolves it. And thus, like that combination of both distance and flattening and simplicity, which may be essential for later adult life, of the diagnostic code, where like, okay, I had this, I didn't know what it was as a child, but actually it was this thing that was happening in my family, right? This sort of way in which the symptom retroactively becomes legible, both as your story of a person who's telling it, but then also as revealing, and in hindsight, to you things that you as a child weren't necessarily capable of articulating or even knowing, but we're just feeling as a symptom, it seems to suggest something very profound, or what the text does, right? Is it gives you this sense that those stories are very important, right? Yeah, sure, like they hold us together. They're how we get through things. But it's the getting through it that is the thing, right? That's the really hard task of life. And what Nick is doing is getting through it. Or is like, we're through it with him, even, and almost more so because we don't know where it really goes.
Yeah. That's absolutely right. Yeah, I that's exactly what I was trying to do with this, and I'm grateful for your for the perceptiveness with which you describe that, because causality is obviously it's having causal narratives are crucial in all kinds of ways for making, as you said, to making sense of our lives, for actually, and it can actually minimize symptoms in many ways. It can, it's part of healing, part of recovery, and so forth. But part of why, and I've always been fascinated by this, and Nick is fascinated by this. Nick is sort of like, it gets suggested to him that maybe his parents' divorce is the key to his condition. And he's really interested in that, because if I can turn what's happening to me into a story, that changes it. It gives it a kind of closure and a kind of distance. And why that is because it becomes a thing. It takes on a kind of wholeness, right? The wholeness of a thing, of an object, where it's like, it's over there. You know what I mean? Like, this happened and this happened, and this is why this happened, right? And now I understand it. But there's always a gap between that story and the actual experience, which is not totally explained by or controlled by that story that you tell about your illness or about your trauma or about your experiences. And I think there's often a desperation. I felt a kind of desperation. Nick feels a kind of desperation in coming up with that, any kind of satisfying or authoritative or strong enough causal narrative that will shut this down, but none of them really do it. And part of it, you said what you said about subject formation. Part of this is really primal, and it's kind of not soluble even theoretically. Which is the like what Hegel talks about, this idea that I become a subject by identifying with the object you see me as. You know what I'm saying? In other words, to become part of the human public world, I in some ways need to be an object. Like one thing I always talk to my students about when I, in class is when we're talking about sort of like ancient Greek ideas and ancient Greek literature and so forth, I'll be like, for the Greeks, the highest aim in many ways was glory, was fame. You know what I mean? When Achilles in that one myth that is sort of adjacent to the Iliad is asked, would you rather die young? Effectively asked, would you rather die young and be remembered forever, or would you rather live to an old age and just sort of be happy and rich and sort of in a mediocre kind of way and then be forgotten? Achilles is like, be remembered forever, for sure. You know what I mean? And I tell my students that, and I'm like, which one would you pick? And they're like, oh, most of them, not all of it, but most of them say we would pick the living longer and not dying young and being remembered forever. And I ask them why, and they say, well, why do you care how you're remembered if you're not there anymore? But then I say, okay, is it the case though that you really don't care about the kind of object you are? You know what I mean? Like you're interested in subjectivity, so you want to be around to feel and think and live. That's why you don't care about this kind of being this kind of object that people love that lasts forever or whatever. That's fine. But is it actually the case in your lives, you know what I mean? In all of our lives, that we don't care maybe more about the object that we're seen as than as the subject that we are. And in fact, don't we often make all kinds of do things that are subjectively painful in order to burnish or polish this object you see me as? You know what I'm saying? So it's like this, the price of becoming a recognizable object in the social or public world is this kind of identification with oneself as an object. And that's and Nick struggles to do that and really is awakened constantly, is like horrified by it. And talking about it at this abstract level, it can seem really sort of philosophical and dry, but in the moment to moment teenage years is when this really the pedal comes to the metal with this shit. You know what I'm talking about? Like,
Yeah.
I'm turning into an object. Like, how much time do we spend as teenagers in front of mirrors? You know what I'm talking about? Like the mirror stage. You know what I mean? It's like that's the zone. It's like, and when you look into a mirror, as Nick does in a couple scenes, what happens if you stare into the mirror long enough is instead of you it's this experience of vortex or a void or this unclosable gap.
It's defamiliarization.
Total defamiliarization.
It's horrifying. It's properly horrifying.
Fear of God. Totally. Yeah, right. I mean, and fear of God in that full sense of it, where you're like, and here I'm thinking about the anxiety versus fear thing. We're like, okay,
I should just say, by the way, is Kierkegaard, and Heidegger stole it from him.
And then Freud gets it too. Yeah. But like this idea of like fear of God, on the one hand, that's an object. It's God. On the other hand, it's fucking God. He's everywhere. What does it mean to be in a position of fear with this, right? Like it's very different from being afraid of, I don't know, like my engine not starting or like of tripping down a staircase. Like it's everywhere. It's ubiquitous. It undoes you as a subject. And in a similar mode, I think, if we're just going to be philosophical here, like the opening gesture of like the
let's just stipulate that the like things you can only do when you're like 15 and sitting around stoned is like also like a philosophy classroom.
Yeah, or podcasting. But like totally the foundational gesture of the entire Cartesian project and the meditation is banishing that I'm dreaming or that there's an evil demon deceiving me, right? Like the disordered divine, whatever this like plane of pure immanence is that undoes me as a subject or as this being in the world, it has to be foreclosed in order for me to do the mature, rational adult task of both being a subject, but also being an object for other people and aware of how I exist for them, etc. And again, what I love about the text, the several things I love about the book is that it, at no point does it feel like this kid who is precocious and reading wildly is using language or terms that are somehow not his. Right? It's never suddenly, much in the same mode as he doesn't get this kind of like very 2020s like retroactive narrative of like how his psychopathology, sort of what really is going on, quote unquote. He never, it's like, then I read this thing years later and this clarified this other thing. Like the characters in the text he's encountering with are stories and things that he's hearing both in his reading of them, but also from other people. It's all imminent in some ways. And
Yeah.
I have to say, thinking about the question you pose to your students about, like, do you want to live forever or live a long time and be, God forbid, living forever? Maybe that's not an option for any of us yet, but like live for a long time comfortably, or go out and be remembered in like the 27 Club or something. On the one hand, like, I get why kids, particularly today, would be like, oh yeah, I want to comfort, safety, whatever. But also so much of, I think, the experience of adolescence, both in the time, but as I remember it, is this sort of impulse, just do it and be a legend, right?
Yeah. Totally.
And that kind of like recklessness, even for, I think many people listening to this will have known kids who, like, in high school, like, went mad, right? Or like the kid who was really, really fascinating, interesting, etc. But now retrospectively, knowing what happened to them, like, oh, there's something really bad happening at home, or this was the schizophrenia diagnosis doesn't surprise me later. Like, you see these things, the break retroactively becomes the master signifier for everything that happened before it. But even for kids I know who were, turn out fine, right? It's still those moments, those stories, those things that happened to them, they still stick with me more than things that happened to me last week, right? Like, like, I don't know, my buddy who minutes after buying a fake ID, like the thing is literally hot off the press in downtown, like he's somewhere in like in the West Village. He's sitting on the stoop, brand new fake ID, drinking a beer he just bought with the fake ID. Cop rolls up. Sir, open container lock? Can I see your ID? My buddy hands him the ID, which is made out to Paul Cezanne of 420 Ocean Boulevard, like Beverly Hills, California, 90210. Cop's like, Mr. Cezanne, next time you're going to need to put that in a paper bag.
Yeah.
He's a
legendary,
that's eternal.
Yeah.
He's a legend. He's Achilles, right? We still have that, right? But I think part of it is we kind of disavow it, or at least childhood or adolescence is the place where these things happen. Right?
Yeah.
It's our
This is very adolescent boy, I will say.
Sure.
I just have to the do it now and be a legend.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. There is there's a certain kind of what's probably pathological. In a lot of the cases I know turned out to be pathological. This desire to be legendary at that age, and the amazing thing is, and I think about this as a literature professor with Shakespeare, people like Shakespeare, who are just like, as long as eyes can see and lips can breathe, so long lives this, and this gives life to thee. Just like with total confidence, being like, yeah, this shit's gonna be around forever. You know what I mean? Like, not only did he think that and want that, he actually did that. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, it's hundreds of years later, we're still doing it. Similarly, with these, your story is exactly right. There's lots of these legendary kids. They really did achieve a kind of legendary status. And one thing is, I write in the book about this guy who I thought is like this moment I thought was the apex of high school coolness, where this guy gets in front of the whole school. I don't remember exactly how he convinced the school to let him do this. It's a Catholic school. It's totally bizarre. He gets up and does this dance to "Staying Alive" by the Bee Gees. You know what I mean? And he was, and it was just like the coolest thing anyone had ever seen, because it was just like, anyone who saw that, you just couldn't imagine. I mean, first of all, it was is the 90s, and it's one of those things where, like, it's that thing where, like, 2 decades before your decade is the pop culture that comes back and is cool again. Well, in Libertyville, we were real slow on that. You know what I mean? So he was introducing the Bee Gees as cool.
Oh, wow.
And doing this dance to it, which was risking all kinds of things, and just through his like intrinsic coolness made it all happen. But I put that in there, and then that's real. That really happened. And then, like, after about a couple weeks after the book came out, I got this email from this guy in Portland who was like, yeah, I was reading your book and I discovered this thing that I did. That was me. That was me.
And he was immortalized.
And and that's what I said. I was like, you're Achilles and I'm Homer, or I'm in the Homer role. You know what I mean? Like my job is really to to write down the glorious story of your legendary thing. You know what I mean? And to me, it's like, there's really not that many things as an adult that you could do that's legendary like that. It just isn't. You know what I mean? You like you do something, you're gonna get arrested. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like it's like, that's not cool. You know what I mean? That's not legendary. It's and so and there's something democratic about it too. It feels like something legendary is actually accessible, like it's within reach.
Mhm.
You may not want to do it. Most people may not want to do or be able to do, but everyone knows someone who could or did do it. And this is a question I have. I'm not sure that's possible anymore with social media. Like, in other
Yeah.
words, I wonder if that moment was tied to a certain kind of media moment where you actually can have a friends group or a high school friend group that is relatively insulated from everyone. Ultimately, maybe it's the case that social media makes the preservation and recording of these legendary moments much more democratic. I don't know. I've never been on social media, but that was a question I had, like, setting it in the 90s. You know what I'm saying?
You're queuing me up beautifully for my next question, which really is about the way that Nick's world isn't our contemporary one. And I was thinking about that this morning as I was reading the New York Times, and it was an article about how New York City, like today is the day where in public schools you can't have your phone anymore, which I will go on record as being like, hooray, the day that they would go out of classrooms, all classrooms is a beautiful day.
For sure.
Your friend in Portland or acquaintance, or I mean, you know what I mean? Person whose act resonated over time. Right?
Our hero whom we sing.
Yes.
Yeah.
Exactly. You know, that's not on TikTok, right? It's not that kind of dance. Like it only, to me, like the power of that also is that it's a story, and that it transforms and takes different like maybe he didn't even remember that. It meant something to you. But, you know, I do think that the setting and the way in which the whole technological landscape is so different from our contemporary one has enormous implications for his character development, and also just for the language, for his lexicon, right? The words that he can reach for. So, you know, there's some adults have these things that we used to call car phones, right? I remember those. But the kids in the book, they don't have cell phones. And so when Nick and his not quite at the time girlfriend, Sarah, want to research panic, like they go to the library in person. And he and Sarah, like they haul out the encyclopedia, like, you know, and it's not like the OED online, right? It's a book. It's a physical book. But this web of associations that they find feels, you know, this as extensive and sort of urgently self-relevant as I think it would to anyone, to a kid today searching on Wikipedia or, you know, wherever the internet would lead them to. And so I want to quote this passage. I read a little from the introductions to the 2 least thick financial panic books. I should say it's because the books that are actually about panic are checked out. Maybe, I thought, they called them financial panics because they're somehow like panic attacks. Or maybe the financial panics came first and they named the other kind, the kind I had, after the financial panics because of how they resembled them. These books turned out to be much more illuminating and relevant than the chemotherapy book. The basic idea of a financial panic is that the stock market starts to fall and then people start to panic. In an extraordinary passage, the author of the second book seemed to suggest that sometimes people just thought that the stock market was about to fall, so they panicked, and only then did the stock market actually fall. This seemed to have potential application to my own case. Close quote. So eventually, and once Sarah gets involved, the associations of panic, they constellate on a figure from another time, right? Pan, a god of Greco-Roman myth. And Nick's relation to Pan is provocative, but it's also left ambiguous. And it's about much more than just how to navigate his anxiety disorder or his intrusive worries, like the ones that you were talking about before, that he's going to come out of his own head. Can you talk about your choice of Pan as a sort of master signifier for this text, and also about something that we've touched on before, but I really want to see if we can get into it a little bit more, the possibility that panic may in fact constitute a kind of insight?
Yeah, yeah. So Pan, part of it was coming up with Pan was through the kind of research that these kids are doing. You know what I mean? Which is, panic. The etymology of panic is, the Greek god Pan. Apparently, mythically had this laugh that would inspire terror. You know what I mean? And those are heard it. And so panic is etymologically related to the god Pan. And the kids discovered that. And when I discovered that, I was like, whoa, that's really interesting. Which I often think when we find psychological disorders having this classical vocabulary and mythic kind of vocabulary associated with them, it gives it this other dimension, the mythic. You know what I'm saying? And so I wanted to have, on the one hand, like you said earlier, I wanted all the vocabulary that these kids have access to be imminent, to come from their world in convincing ways, and really not to feel like some application of psychological or philosophical ideas on my part onto these characters. And having it be related to my own experience discovering this stuff was helpful in doing that. But so on the one hand, I wanted, oh, wow, could there be some relation between panic and the mythic, or this kind of pagan god? And the mystery that gives a certain slant to the mystery of what one's confronting with panic, the mystery that panic discloses of the strangeness of the world. And Pan is the god of the wild, right? Of wildness, of the uncontrollable energies, right? Of that which sort of spills over, of that which is formless. You know what I mean? If Apollo is sort of like the kind of avatar of the form-giving qualities, at least in the Nietzschean kind of model, and in other places also, Pan to me has this feeling of form-devouring kinds of qualities, right? Of the formless, and laughter as being the thing is fascinating to me. And I work a lot with dark comedy and laughter in the book as having this kind of demonic or pagan kind of form-devouring kind of quality to it. But then there are other implications of Pan that I also wanted to sort of sneak in, which is Pan means all, you know what I mean? Like the ubiquity, Patrick, that you were referring to earlier. It's everywhere, it's everything. And then panpsychism, you know what I mean? This idea that consciousness is everywhere, is ubiquitous. And, part of what I'm interested in with this book is, and this gets to the insight piece, which is, okay, panic shows you the world is weird and that there's something deeply unsettling, or discover something deeply unsettling about consciousness, about the fact that one is conscious, that one is a subject, and so forth. And actually, it is the case that there is something very strange and hard to understand about consciousness and its relationship to objects. And with Pan, and I've been fascinated by panpsychism for a long time, and it has roots that go, the Romantics had a version of panpsychism. I mean, it goes back, but recently it's gotten a lot of. It's been taken seriously in certain philosophical and neuroscientific quarters as a kind of speculative solution to the problem of consciousness. Galen Strawson, for example, has written a lot about this, in which it's actually arguably easier to imagine that consciousness is the sort of substrate of the entire physical world than it is to try to come up with some account of how consciousness emerges from matter. Bracketing that, whether one accepts that those kinds of arguments about panpsychism or not, it's definitely the case that there's something weird about consciousness and its tethering or its relationship to to the mind. So that's I wanted all, like, pan was a good word, you know what I mean, to get all these different kinds of significances. And in terms of the insight, I think this is true with panic and with anxiety, as I write in the book. The actual phenomenology of panic, it does not have the feel of, like, it just feels like you're discovering something real. You know what I mean? Panic has like a kind of, in terms of the thoughts and the cognition, it's very similar to like discovering something you were looking for, like being a detective and discovering something. It's like, oh, I never really thought about how horrible diabetes is. You know what I'm talking about?
Yeah.
Or like, wow, this connection, you know what I mean? Like I remember, like, you know, this isn't in the book too much, but I remember I was obsessed with diabetes, hypochondriac about it at that age. And I just remember discovering like these symptoms of diabetes. Each one I would discover would be like this clue. And I would, you know what I mean? It was like you're learning something. And that's a silly example, but the idea that with panic, with anxiety, you're seeing something, you're discovering something real. That's behind Heidegger's, you know, and other philosophers' idea that anxiety is kind of foundational for philosophy and foundational for human being in these ways. And I think that's true in a way that something like depression is not, you know what I'm saying? Or other kinds of moods are not. Like anxiety feels like insight, and it often is an insight because it's a defamiliarization of the world. And it's just the case that most of the time, for very good evolutionary and social reasons, and personal reasons, most of the world is automated. We don't think about 99% of what's going on, you know, or even experience it really. Panic in peeling off the layers of habit and automation gives us that direct experience of reality and all of its uncanniness. So that's where I think of why Nick is so compelled by what he thinks of as panic's insights.
I mean, I think this also tethers, I mean, what you're saying right now helps me articulate something that was slightly more inchoate when I was rereading Whiteout and reading Pan. And I should say that Whiteout is the rare drug memoir that is like, maybe I should do more drugs, right? Like even as it is coming from a place of recovery, but also in the same way that Pan is sort of like, but maybe more panic. Right? That there is a sense, and there's an image that, unless I'm totally confabulating this, is in both books. One from the perspective of you know, being on drugs, not necessarily heroin, but being on drugs, and the other of overwhelming anxiety is you're looking out from your face. And suddenly you just realize, like, you can see a little bit of your hair, right? And you can see like the ways in which like you're talking out of your face, right? And there's this like edge to everything, and like the edges of the world of perception become perceptible. And it reminds me of the moment in William James's Varieties of Religious Experience, where he's talking about nitrous, which is a different kind of drug and a lot less long lasting. But the idea is sort of, we think there's only one kind of consciousness, but then you do drugs and you realize there's tons, and you can just kind of step sideways into this other mode of perception and cognition. And that is something that tethers these two forms of experience, both of which can be extraordinarily unpleasant, but also for different reasons desirable, right? Not being out of your head.
Yeah. And I love William James, and just the varieties. And this is I have I guess I have a fundamentally kind of mystical sensibility. Like Zen Buddhism has always been something that made a lot of just intuitive sense to me as a way of seeing the world. And just the fact that There's this Zen sort of koan kind of saying, and I always mangle it whenever I reproduce it, but it's something like, you die and are reborn 60,000 times a second. You know what I mean? Like it's some impossible number, but just the sense that that quote unquote ordinary consciousness is invaded and divided and multiple and strange in all of these ways. And yet most of the time, I at least, and I'm guessing a lot of other people, we don't have any access to that. We're just in this dull place. You know what I mean? In this dull place with these ghosts of thinking about careers or what like real things, but it's but totally disconnected from that kind of magic and mystery of consciousness and of life and the weirdness and wildness of life. And there's a fundamental ambiguity about actually experiencing the world in all of its intensity, as it's always lying potential for us to experience, and we rarely actually do, because there's a fundamental ambiguity where defamiliarization is simultaneously totally joyous and ecstatic and also terrifying and horrible. You know what I mean? Like it just has that doubleness. And like, with the thing about Whiteout and I guess about Pan, which I've always felt, especially with Whiteout, I've always felt weird about, because the first review of it in the New Yorker sort of made the point you did, which it has a kind of way of making drug use seem compelling. And I obviously, as someone in recovery, I who's lost many friends and family members to death from addiction. That's the last message I want to put out there. But to write honestly about these experiences is to present them in that fundamental ambiguity. You know what I mean? Where it's like, there are horrible things about this, there are amazing things about this. I guess one way to think about it is, I think of these kinds of experiences as portals, as insights into a kind of reality that can be accessed in different ways. And for me, autobiographically and as a writer, those just happen to be the experiences that were sort of roots into different ways of thinking about consciousness and reality, or coming into contact with a defamiliarized kind of reality that I can pursue through like meditation and art in a more sustained way. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
But certainly I think there is, I don't think there's a need for a book to indict panic. You know what I'm talking about? Or like, you know what I'm saying? Like I'm not out for that. You know what I mean? Like, and it's also, I don't think like panic is like this great thing.
Panic, wrong for America.
Yeah. Like, say no to panic. You know what I mean? So, what I'm interested in is really trying to recreate that experience, really kind of show it in its strangeness and in that ambiguous, like simultaneous, ecstatic, horrifying kind of thing.
This way in which like consciousness is, or at least stable self-consciousness as you navigate through the world, is both, well, it believes the world of its strangeness. It has habit. I'm thinking here of like Beckett on Proust, right? Habit is
totally.
It's the chain that connects a dog to its vomit that it just keeps eating is the line. Or like, oh my God, it's metal as fuck, right? But like this way, like, yeah, habit's bad, and habit accustoms us to things, but also
contra Aristotle.
Yeah. Oh yeah, this is like a virtue ethics of like being, I don't know, like robbed of your senses over time, or just like the grind getting to you. But on the other hand, habit, or at least having some degree of cohesive self-consciousness, is how you navigate the world and get out of certain situations. And that kind of tightrope walk where it's like consciousness is an achievement, but also can be overwhelmed by things that then make you lose it in bad ways, but also can overwhelm itself. Right. And this is like the thinking yourself into madness idea, or even like what's the core of so much of the panic attack stuff. Like, am I about to be having a panic attack? Is a panic attack about to happen? Oh no, is this panic? Is that panic? And then you start panicking over the possibility.
Jesus, you're going to give me a panic attack doing that.
I'm sorry, like the meta panic thing, right? Where you're like, is this a symptom? Is this a symptom?
Am I going to be able to fall asleep? Oh my God, what if I'm not going to be able to fall asleep? Oh my God, I'm not asleep.
Yeah, it is this kind of thing where you're like, on the one hand, you want to move through the world with like directed intentionality of purpose. On the other hand, your sensorium and the fact that you can think means that your intentional direction in like the phenomenological sense, like what you're attending to, is not an object of your exclusive control. And that's a hell of a situation to be in. It's a thing that we all kind of have to manage. And yet, and I think this just feels like a recurrent problem, or like a thing that you keep, or problematic, as it were, like this like properly existential concern that so much of your work is exploring. This is a thing that, or this like quandary, or the work that's involved in just maintaining that tightrope walk is, well, it's just that it's work. And there are times and moments and things that can like alleviate that, or that can promise some sort of like a kaisura, or some sort of suspension of that. And sometimes that can be truly horrible, right? Or like you can just, that can, some, here, I'll speak personally here. Like I'm thinking about like the insight of altering your, that comes from altering your sensorium. I don't drink anymore, right? It's something I've stopped and I'm happy not to do. But I remember the first time I had a really stiff cocktail. I'm like 16, 17, fancy bar, gimlet, amazing, right? But I'm having this drink, and after I'm done with it, I feel taut muscles in the back of my neck and shoulders that I didn't even know were clenched unclenching, right? Or like feelings that I was having about other people, I could suddenly feel them, and they had this like luminous intensity. And there was this brief moment like, oh, this is a thing. Like I realized I was carrying a weight that I hadn't realized I was carrying until it was alleviated, and things suddenly took on this additional kind of vividness. But even then I was like, oh, this is a little scary. Right? The part of you that wants to always be there in this space and to imagine a possibility of always having that is only a thing that you can imagine once you're sort of outside the space, or anticipating the space, knowing that it can come. It's not the same sort of thing that you were going into it, or the thing that you were even having it happen to you, right? It sort of recedes in this way. And maybe I'm just picking up what you're laying down here too, in terms of like the Zen stuff, or like this, I feel like we may have a certain shared background in like a Catholic education, and then the turn to sort of like Zen and Rinzai Zen in particular, but like this thematization of consciousness is both a burden and an achievement, but then also when it's suspended or altered, sometimes those aren't necessarily experiences of nascent addiction or of surrendering yourself to become the object of processes that exceed you. Those can also be moments of luminous insight, or they're things that have almost the structure of that type of experience, like the limit experience that undoes or makes you reflect on the site of experiencing in the world. That has an aesthetic character, or there's something that happens there. And I keep coming back to the line. It's a beautiful line of poetry from a poem we don't get to hear, that Nicholas's girlfriend reads him, and that becomes a type of glyph for so much of the text. Beauty is a shape open to feeling. It's such a wonderful line, because it's not like beauty is a thing that you see and then you put feelings into it. Right? There's no like percipient. The site of the perception is not a ordered, intentionally cohesive subject. It's an openness to form and possibility. And that kind of like receptivity is necessary and so important. Even, so much of what adolescence seems to be, and this is a way in which I think like adolescence kind of does resemble, at least structurally, some of what we're talking about in terms of the drugs and other experiences, where the association of things being intense with there being more real, or with your experiences happening to you for the first time and meaning the world. We sort of get to have that, or we're forced to have that. And that's actually like a rite of passage, or it's like something happens in that period, in that movement between being a very young child and being an adult who supposedly can be more together, that is dispositive of something really profound and aesthetically capacious about the human experience.
Yeah, and in hearing you describe that, I think, well, for me it's really romanticism, like it's romantic aesthetics, like John Keats, in a famous letter, described the quality that a great poet has. He's talking about Shakespeare, who's the great poet for the Romantics, as negative capability, right? As a capacity to be in doubt, to be comfortable with contradiction, to be open, you know what I'm saying? And so he's reacting against really the idea of a kind of expressive model of creativity, where it's like the poet or the writer or the artist is really expressing something in them that other people don't have or don't have quite the same way, or allows people to see what they have inside them. Keats is like, no, what it's really about is receptivity. It's really about receptivity and about a high degree of receptivity. And that's amazing. I've always been really compelled by that. But then the thing what you said about intensity, you know, I also think about Keats. Keats is like kind of the first poet I think of. I'm sure there's always predecessors. You know, the thing about the history of art is just that it's cyclical. It's not progressive. But I associate it with Keats, which is the idea that he replaces scales of value like real or fake or good or bad with intense and dull. For him, intensity is the ultimate value. It's the ultimate value. And that and it's you know, it's not accidental. Keats is the poet who dies young. Romanticism is sort of the art form that is the adolescent art form, for good and ill. You know what I'm talking about? Like it's the art form that is like totally risking wild embarrassment, you know, all the time, like saying like cringe things like all the time, you know what I'm talking about? But at the same time, that's the price of inhabiting that zone where intensity is really what you're after. And all that comes with it, you know, the vision of the Greeks that Keats had, you know what I'm saying? Like, so Keats is like a really, really important figure for me. And the kind of the model of the aesthetic that you're talking about, I think is really I associate it with a kind of Keatsian aesthetic, and with beauty. So yeah, Sarah in my novel, you just get that one line of her beauty is a shape open to feeling. But I talk about beauty a few times in the novel, and actually, like, beauty is kind of a problematic term for romantic aesthetics because they're not. In other words, it can risk shading into prettiness or into just whatever, you know, the Kantian thing, what the shape that pleases or that one finds pleasing. They're really after bigger game that is almost has religious qualities, ontological kinds of ambitions. And so beauty is always like, it is just a sign of something else. You know what I mean? It's a symptom of some other, you know, other thing that is happening. And so that impulse that restless impulse to always be going deeper and to not be content with the beautiful kind of surface is another part of what I associate with romantic aesthetics. And I feel like the kids in this book are romantics in that sense, as maybe, you know, maybe we all are as teenagers.
Michael, I had another question queued up, but I feel like we really got into so much stuff, and I have to ask you one other question.
Yeah.
More Than a Feeling, the Boston song. It's a great song. We'll drop it. We'll drop a little clip in, enough to not get it taken down off of YouTube. I listened to it this morning when we were getting ready. It is not my favorite Boston song. That would be foreplay long time. But I really could see like why this group of panic and psychedelic adolescents would be like, you just got to put on More Than a Feeling. So I have to ask about the role that this plays for you for the novel.
It's such a weird thing. Like, first of all, like in my own personal life, with the kids I was hanging out with, like, I would have been kicked out of the barn if I had played More Than a Feeling. It was like considered like total cringe.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like at that time. And my own experience with it was, I remember hearing it when I was around that age. It just came on the radio. and just being like, there's something magical about this song. You know what I mean? But not really having anything to talk about because it was like, classic rock, which was like deeply uncool at that time, even at that time, you know what I mean? In the 90s, at least among the people I was hanging out with. And so it was really much later when I was writing the book. And it was one of those things where it's like, it's kind of a classic thing where you start with an ironic sense of this, of the pop cultural object, and then you quickly lose any irony. You know what I mean? And then I'm just like, actually, this is a truly great song. And reading about the guy spent like years, like making it, thinking about it. It has this like fascinating kind of history. And so it was, and then the cover, the album cover, which is like a UFO. And then just imagining this could be something that the kids could really like go wild on in terms of interpreting. But ultimately, and there's this kind of like, interpretation that Nick and his girlfriend have about Sarah have about the meaning of the song and like and what happens when you listen to it at different volumes and stuff like that. That's all like not real. I didn't really, but it was just sort of like, yeah. Ultimately, I came in with a kind of ironic. Let me just put this song that seems like impossibly like uncool or overplayed or whatever, and have these kids like really finding something cool in it. But I came away from the experience of writing about it like deeply convinced that it's a truly great song. So that's my voyage, with More Than a Feeling.
It is a truly great song, and I also feel like it's deeply Freudian. Anxiety. It's more than a feeling.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. More. Yeah. The title is really what did it. Like more than a feeling. You know what I mean? Like, that's It's open for interpretation.
Well, Michael, this has been such a delight.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for talking with us today.
Thank you so much. This has been, I really, really enjoyed speaking with you, and really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Ordinary Unhappiness. Ordinary Unhappiness is made possible by the generous support of our Patreon community, which also keeps it ad-free for everyone. If you'd like to support the show and get 2 additional episodes per month, including our Journey Through the Standard Edition and our Wild Analysis Pop Culture series, please head on over and find us at patreon.com/ordinaryunhappiness. This has been an episode of Ordinary Unhappiness, a podcast about psychoanalysis, politics, pop culture, and the ways we suffer now. I'm Abby Cluchin, and today I was joined by Patrick Blanchfield and Michael Clune. This podcast is produced by Dan Yowell. Theme music by Formal Chicken.